Why do all animals tend to have the same number of heartbeats per lifetime?
Oh boy, that's a
I think
I'm giving a
that's a good
talk.
one.
Yeah, it's a good one. There's a workshop we're running beginning Wednesday through Friday, which is it's called the limits of immortality. Actually, it's I am has got brackets around it, so it's kind of a ambiguous limit. So it goes to a little bit to this question, but and I'm giving a talk on that. So funny enough, I was just looking at this question in terms of preparing my little talk. Um, so, um, so there are these scaling laws. They existed before I certainly came on the scene, as I said, and I was intrigued by them, and I started working on them. And this is an answer to your question, but I need to give some background. And I asked myself the question: how is it that all these things line up on this straight line? By the way, for those that aren't familiar, typically these scaling laws are what we call mathematically power laws. You don't have to know technically what that means, but here's what it means sort of in English. So the Kleiber's law that I mentioned goes from a mouse to an elephant, for example. Actually goes to a whale, goes from a shrew to a whale, actually, which is a factor of 100 million and to the eighth in size. And if you were to make a graph, if I were to give you the data, I gave you the weight of the animal and its metabolic rate, and I said, plot this. And you started plotting it on a sheet of graph paper, and you did it in the usual linear way. So you go, 1 gram, 2 grams, 3 grams, 4 grams, 5 grams, and all the way up to a whale, which is 100 million grams. I did the calculation, but I don't know you'd have to have a sheet. If you were sitting in Palo Alto, probably that sheet of graph paper would extend way beyond San Francisco in order to get it on, because it's 100 million. So that's not the way you plot it, obviously. So this is a lead up to saying you obviously have to do something much more condensed. And the way you do it is you plot it by factors of 10. Instead of going at 1, 2, 3, you go 1, 10, 100,
Logarithmic
1,000, logarithmically. That's called So you plot it logarithmically, both in terms of weight and metabolic rate. And when you do that, and this was the point of origin of Kleiber's law, you see a straight line, which is kind of amazing, the simplest possible thing in the most complex system in the universe. I mean, it's incredible. Not only that, the slope of that line is approximately 3/4. And that has all kinds of amazing consequences, which we can talk about in a moment. But and as I said earlier, if you look at any physiological quantity that you can measure, or any life history event, life history meaning how long you take to mature, your growth rate, how long you live, how many children you have, they all scale like this too. And all of them, and here's what's remarkable that I didn't emphasize before, have slopes analogous to that 3/4 for metabolic rate that are simple multiples of 1/4, number 4. So you ask yourself, and I ask myself, when the hell does this number 4 come from? Why 4? And just a side editorial comment, how come in biology this wasn't some huge begging question overhanging biology, that the number of genes scales with this chord? I mean, it's like it permeates everything. So I thought, that's what I worked. So it turns out you ask yourself, what is it that is common to all life? Well, if you think in terms of complex systems, it's hundreds of these agents, millions of these agents. You have 10 to the 14th, 100 trillion cells make up your body. And they have to act in a, roughly speaking, well, they have to be supported in a, roughly speaking, democratic and efficient fashion, and also in a highly coherent fashion so you can function. Well, how do you do that? Well, you know how you've done it. You are a bunch of networks. That's how you did it. That's who you are. You're a bunch of networks. The most prominent of which, that we're most familiar with, well, the two most prominent, our cardiovascular system and our brains. But everything is, our renal system, our bones are even networks, of course. But respiratory system, we're a bunch of networks. And so I thought, well, all organisms have to have networks. Maybe it is the mathematical, physical properties of these networks that is constraining everything in some way. Now, so I put together a bunch of principles for these networks, and they have to transcend design because you're not a tree. And by the way, the other remarkable thing about these laws, it wasn't just true for, say, mammals, but it was true for plants, trees, which is kind of amazing because they're completely different to us. But they're still networks. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, it was writing down, mathematizing a bunch of ideas about these networks, putting them into mathematics, and then working all that out that you could explain the quarter power scaling laws. And a crucial element, an absolutely crucial element, huge assumption, is that, for example, of the networks that we are made of, the ones that are actually, the ones that have evolved are ones that in some sense are optimized. And so the idea was that take our circulatory system, of the infinite possibilities that our circulatory system could have, the one that has evolved is the one for all of us, not just, in fact, not just all human beings, but all mammals and all mammals that have ever existed. The one that has evolved is the one that minimizes the amount of energy your heart has to expend in order to pump blood through that system in order to supply cells so that you can then function. So very simple idea, but the idea is you want to minimize the amount of energy you use to stay alive, to live, to function, hunt and gather, so that you can maximize the energy you can allocate to sex, reproduction, and the raising of your offspring, which is Darwinian fitness. So you want to maximize. So it's a different way of expressing the classic optimization that is implicit in the idea of the survival of the fittest and the idea of Darwinian fitness. So, and I'm not going to go out, there's no point in this in trying to tell you anything about the way the mathematics goes, but suffice it to say that when you work it all out, amazingly out pops all those scaling laws, and which is very satisfying and very nice. And most important in this was that now there's a personal bit that I was working on this on my own, and then the serendipity took place that I was contacted by someone that knew me well at the Stanford Institute, who said that there was a well-known biologist, ecologist, this guy Jim Brown, who was becoming associated with the Stanford Institute, who was looking for some physicist he could talk to try to understand these scaling laws. And I couldn't believe it. I said, my God, that's amazing, because I said, I know this sounds weird, but not only have I been working on them, I understand them, and I understand their origin, I believe. Well, it turns out that was a little bit hasty. It was true to some extent, to a large degree, but it needed a lot of time working with Jim Brown and his then student Brian Inquist to get all the I's dotted and the T's crossed and get it all straight, because I knew no biology. All the biology I did to do the mathematics, I just went in those days to the library. This is pre being able to Google it. I went to the library and just studied books on physiology and on ecology and on natural selection and sort of picking up in the gutter kind of thing. And it was wonderful to have Jim, who is a wonderful scientist, be able to really explain things and tell me what's important and what isn't and so on. And that was absolutely crucial. Anyway, we got it straight, and then we published this paper showing how all these scaling laws derive. I mean, 50, 75 of them, I don't know, for both mammals, plants, trees, but in different systems and so on. And then it grew. Then we took it into now you have a theory. I mean, this is one of the wonderful things about physics, I think, is that once you have sort of general principles, you can apply it anywhere. So we applied it to things like growth to understand growth. Why is it, why do you grow quickly and then stop? Well, the usual thing is, there's some gene turns off. Well, it turns out you don't need genes. The theory automatically does it. It does it. The fact that metabolic rate scales as mass to the 3/4, that means that slope is going up less than linearly, which means in English, you double the size of an organism, you would think naively you need twice as much food because there's twice as many cells. No, you only need 75%. You save 25%. That's the quarter. And that's because this network is constraining you and optimizing the system. And so the supply, when you grow and you eat, you metabolize, send metabolic energy through networks, it goes to the cells. For you and me, it repairs the cells, it feeds the cells, it replaces ones that died. But when you were 10 years old, some of that energy was going to make new cells. And so, and that's the demand. The demand of the system is to make new cells. And that's kind of a linear process, just keep adding them. And the demand is linear, but the supply is the metabolic rate constrained by the network, which is sublinear. It's only got this increasing 75% with every doubling, but the demand is demanding 100% with every doubling. Well, eventually the supply can't keep up with the demand, and you stop. So when you do the mathematics, it fits perfectly on these wonderful growth curves of organisms, and you get a universal theory of growth and so on. So you can do all kinds of things once you have it, and we've done all kinds of things. And it's been very satisfying. And by the way, one of the nice kind of images for me is that, when you just look at mammals, I mean, we all recognize they have similarities. That's obvious. Otherwise, they wouldn't be called mammals. But, they're so different. I mean, but what this theory says and what the scaling laws say is that even though the whale lives in the ocean and the elephant has a trunk and the giraffe a long neck, and, we walk around on two legs and the mouse scurries around, actually, to kind of 80, 90%, in terms of anything that you could measure, we're just scaled versions of one another. You are a scaled down giraffe, actually. Not your neck. Your neck is an outlier in that, obviously. But otherwise, in terms of most things you can measure, almost everything measure you are, which is kind of, and in fact, since the whole biosphere satisfies these laws, it's kind of very spiritual. There's something about the fact that we all are sort of similar. We all have these networks, and they're all constrained in the same way. We don't even know that the mathematics is at work. Those trees in the forest, when you walk through, look like some random bunch. The leaves look arbitrary. But in fact, when you examine them through this lens and you look at the data, they satisfy these scaling laws. They satisfy these laws. They're obeying these laws. It's not arbitrary, that forest. It's highly constrained with great regularity. And so it's wonderful to be able to reveal that through these principles, which has made me very philosophical in my old age.
I think I missed, though, why, for instance, we have the same number of heartbeats as a mouse.
So now I'm sorry. Yeah, I told you I would get carried. This is my problem. Sorry. I'm so sorry. So all of this I did in order to understand why I'm going to die soon, basically.
Yes.
I mean, that was my motivation. And so here's the point. That scaling law of metabolic rate, that the slope going as 3/4, less than linear, means that per cell, if you look per cell, the metabolic rate of a cell is decreasing with size. That is, the same cell in your body the same cell, sorry, in a dog's body, your liver cell and a dog's liver cell are basically the same. But in the dog's body, it's working much harder, following this 25% rule. And in a cat, it's working even harder. And in a mouse, it's working even harder. So there's this progression, and you can calculate how much harder. But if it's working harder, it's doing more damage. It's damaging, it's creating entropy. It's wearing and tearing more. Therefore, this is the simple argument, simple version of the argument. Therefore, it wears out faster. Therefore, in a systematic way, small things die sooner than big things in a predictable, systematic way, following this quarter power, this kind of 25% rule. And indeed they do. So the idea is that the metabolic rate, just to repeat, the metabolic rate is increasing less than linearly, which means that on a per cell basis, per cell metabolic rate is decreasing. Cells are working less hard. The bigger you are, therefore you live longer because you're creating less entropy, less damage on the one hand. So it's decreasing following this 25% rule. On the other hand, heart rates, which is part of the circulatory system, like all times in this, are all determined again by cellular rates. But cellular rates are, in fact, increasing. These rates are increasing with time. So heart rates, I'm sorry, I said it backwards. Cellular rates are decreasing. So heart rates are decreasing systematically. And in fact, you look at the data. So the theory predicts, you have to, of course, I'm saying these in words, but you have to, of course, work out from the theory. Heart rates are decreasing with time. With size, heart rates are decreasing from this 25% rule. Now, if you're doing less damage with cell following this 25% rule, the consequence of that is that lifespan increases by 25% with each doubling. I mean, it's just the opposite. You're doing less damage, so it takes much longer to do the same amount of damage following this 25% rule. So you have these two phenomena taking place, all coming from the constraint of the network on cells. On the one hand, heart rates are decreasing with size, with 25%. On the other hand, lifespan is increasing with 25%. And when you multiply them together, so you multiply heart rate decreasing with 25%, lifespan increasing by 25%. You multiply them together, the two 25% cancel each other. So you have this very simple consequence. Lifespan times heart rate is the same for everybody. The two 25% are canceled. But what is heart rate times lifespan? That's just the number of heartbeats in a lifetime. So the theory predicts, and the data confirms, that the number of heartbeats in a lifespan is the same whether you're a shrew that lives for just over a year and has a heart rate of, 1,200 times a minute, or a blue whale which lives for 125 years and has a heart rate that is, I think it's something like 15 to 20 beats per minute. They both have the same, and it's about 1.5 billion. A billion and a half heartbeats. And this is a good segue, actually, to cities, because that's what we had once upon a time. Before we, when we were hunter-gatherers and so on, when we were non-socioeconomic human beings, when we were part of the biosphere. So when we were part of the biosphere, our metabolic rate was exactly what it should be, which it is. It is now. I mean, it's high, and I'll say something about that in a minute. But beginning with the discovery of language, the evolution of language, the discovery of agriculture, becoming sedentary, and then writing, and therefore at that time the discovery of economies of scale, that is, the two of us working together can do more than each of us working individually on a project. So getting the idea of community being producing greater efficiency, and the coming of agriculture so that we can be sedentary led to communities and into cities. That changed everything. That separated us from the rest of the biosphere. And just to completely jump ahead, that we've gone from having, one thing I didn't say, I talked about the scaling of metabolic rate, but I didn't say what our metabolic rate is. Well, you know what it is. It's 2,000 food calories a day, on the side of your cereal box, roughly speaking, it's 2,000, whatever it is. But most people don't realize is that 2,000 food calories a day, that's energy per unit time, is the equivalent to about 90 watts. So the amount of energy you need to stay alive is the equivalent to an old incandescent light bulb, which is unbelievable. I mean, biology is absolutely extraordinarily efficient. We are unbelievably. I mean, that's unbelievable.
Unfortunately, because I'd like to eat about 6,000 calories a day.
Yeah. Well, some do. If you're a major, my son was a great rower, and he was using, I think, 7,000 calories a day.
Wow.
I mean,
I'm jealous of that. I actually eat 4,000, so that's still a good number, but not.
Why? Do you work out a lot? Are you
I do.
Oh yeah, then you would have to. Yeah, but me, I'm a sedentary person, and and then when you get old, your metabolism goes way down. So I probably use much less than 2,000 now, but that's only 90 90 to 100 watts. So before we evolved from sort of hunter gatherers, our basal. I should say this again. Our basal metabolic rate, which is just how much you need just to stay alive. So you could think of it while you're asleep. I don't know. That's about 90 watts. If you add in that, all the hunting and gathering you got to do, move around, get food, look after the kids. As a hunter-gatherer, that adds about a factor of 2 or 3 for all animals systematically. I mean, whatever their basal was, you multiply somewhere between 2 and 3. That's their total metabolic rate. And there are people on this planet there are still hunter-gatherers in the Amazon and in Borneo that only use their total metabolic rate is 300 watts. But now you can ask the question, once you have communities and cities and all the marvelous things that we have, and then we start this unbelievable mad adventure, wonderful adventure that we've been on for the last 10,000 years, leading us to be here, me in Santa Fe, you in Palo Alto, being able to do these marvelous things within this incredibly short period of time. You can ask, what's our metabolic rate now? Well, of course, our biological basal metabolic rate is still 90 watts, where yours is twice that because you work out so much. But for most of us, it's around still 2,000 food calories a day. But your social metabolic rate, your active metabolic rate, equivalent to what the hunter-gatherers are, is now 11,000 watts instead of 100 watts. We are 50 to 100 times more than we should be. We are 50 times more than we should be for active. So we're way off. And you can turn that around and ask, how big an animal are each of us in the United States? And we're sort of equivalent to about 30,000 kilograms. Each one of us behaves as if we were. We're about not quite the size of a blue whale, but we're about a dozen elephants, each one of us.
Is the social metabolic rate sort of taken by dividing the energy that goes into a city by the amount of people?
Roughly, very roughly. So it is, so the idea then, and that's why I say this is a good segue to cities, because of going back to what I said before, we are social collective organisms. We are part of a community, and we can't be removed. We can't exist outside of that in some form. So So when I say that social, that's why I call it social metabolic rate. You are, of course, not just you. There's all your clothes. There's your cell phone. There's your automobile. There's the roads. There's the building you're in. There's Stanford. There's the Bay Area. All of these are part of you. You carry that with you. That is who you are. And each one of us has some of that, piece of that, inevitably, to varying degrees. But on the average, that number is about 11,000 watts. So exactly what you just said. It's pretty much, roughly speaking, how much energy is in the city or the country, depends on what unit you want to take, and divide that by that. And that's how much each of us needs. Whereas if you took the hunter-gatherer community, that number would be, 250, 300 watts.